First of all, I would like to say many thanks to the department at the Kiev Municipal Academy of Music for inviting me to this International Scientific and Creative Project Festival. I'm happy to contribute here with a paper in which I will play a little bit too. The title of my paper is called Unlocking Genius at the Keyboard, Nicola Zingarelli's Path to Invention and Intuition. My name is Peter van Tour. I am faculty of music at Örebro University in Sweden, and my research has been mainly on the pedagogical traditions and the traditions of teaching counterpoint in the Neapolitan conservatories, the first conservatories in the world. As I will try to explain in this lecture, there is a lot of documented material from the Neapolitan conservatories from the 18th century, in which we can get a glimpse about the effectiveness of their teaching, which was very practically orientated, and in which students learned to create a foundation to composition by playing with their hands on the keyboard. So I think it is wonderful to participate with this lecture in the title of this festival, because as the festival title signifies, this is about modern music science, but also performance. And I hope to show that the very roots of our conservatory tradition are about this unity of compositional theory, if one may call it like that, and performance, and how this was a unity for students in the 18th century. So, before I begin, I will give a short outlook on what to expect. So the first thing I will do is to talk a little bit about what partimento is. It is a relatively new branch of research, and I will explain why that is the case. And I will show quite a lot of materials from these partimento traditions and see what we can do with them today. My work on this topic has been going on for maybe 1.5 decades now. I've done a lot of traveling in Europe and photographed most of the manuscripts that are in almost all European countries, and I have tried to create databases for the pedagogical materials of the Neapolitan conservatories, or even the all of Italy, and try to figure out chronology, but also problems with attributions through this database. And from there I have started to resonate about what kind of different schools did we have in 18th century Italy, and what these schools represented and how they worked differently practically on the keyboard, but also in written composition and in written counterpoint. So let's see. First of all, the word partimento is a word that already appears in the early 17th century in Italy. And it was used in connection with what we today would call part books. So if we have a part book for the organ player, for example, if we buy a set of part books of, let's say, motets or masses for 8-part choir or something like that, we may expect to get one part book for the organ player. And such part books for organ players could be called partimento per l'organo. So in this case, here is one of the very oldest examples of the usage of the term in connection with the part book for an organist. And it says partimento de bassi per l'organo. So it's a bass part for the organ player. Now, if we would compare what this bass part would show, we would see that the organ player is always playing the lowest sounding part in the complete score. Although there is no complete score, but there are only part books for the various singers. But the organist would play the lowest sounding part. Now, this is around the same time when the notational device of thorough bass was grounded or was founded or invented. So in this case, there are not a lot of figures in this part book, but it's already the usage of this word part book or part for the keyboard player. Now, all along the 17th century, we see that partimenti were gradually started to be used in teaching composition. So some composers, especially in the late 17th century, they found that this way of notating like a bass part over which we can expect polyphonic music was actually a very good pedagogical device to learn players to imagine what voices we could hear over a figured bass. So it became a pedagogical tool to learn counterpoint. So if we think about counterpoint in today's schools, we often think about written exercises. A lot of exercises we work out on paper, and then the teacher would correct them. At this time, it was rather a practical thing where teachers played counterpoint and where you learned the language of counterpoint by imitation and through variation. So partimenti were gradually and increasingly used for practical studies on the keyboard to learn the language of counterpoint. Now here we have a very early one from 1670. This is housed in the British Library in London. And it's basically a 16th century chanson, Suzanne un jour, which is here notated in a bass part, although unfigured, but it's already called partimento personale, so a part to be played on the keyboard. And probably I imagine that there were singers doing this piece, and the keyboard player was orientating himself by hearing what the singers would sing and try to play by ear what he is hearing. Okay, the city of Naples was called at the time in the 18th century was called the capital of music in Europe, the European capital of music, and it was called like that because of the outstanding place that music played in this city. There were several opera houses. There were 4 conservatories up to around 1750. And people traveled to Naples from all over Europe to learn to become a musician. And to become a musician was something that involved not only playing and singing, but also composition. Yeah, so the normal way of having an education as a musician would be to also compose. So singing was involved, keyboard playing was involved, and composition was involved. And then probably a main instrument such as violin or flute or oboe or clarinet could be the case. Okay, the place we see here is actually the central piazza in Naples. To the left we see a church. This church was called Chiesa di San Luigi di Palazzo. So it's in front of the palace, the royal palace. And it was said that this was the most beautiful church in Naples. It was covered with gold and silver. It was very luxury on the inside, and tourists were amazed by what they saw when they entered this church. And it was also the king's and the queen's church. And in front of the church was the royal palace, so that was the place where the king lived. This church, Chiesa di San Luigi di Palazzo, was also the church where there was an annual music festival for the conservatories. So every year in October there were 9 days, a 9-day festival. And during these 9 days there were a few, maybe 4 or 5 concerts every day with music that had been composed by students, by teachers, and also by old students or former students. And this festival was a real happening for the inhabitants of Naples. And people came to visit Naples to enjoy this festival, which was something quite amazing. Just behind the palace we see a glimpse of the opera, which is still there, the opera, the Teatro di San Carlo, yeah, so the royal opera house. And it was the largest opera house in the world. Yeah, so it had a high ranking in Italy, in the opera world of the 18th century. Now here we see the same piazza from the other direction, and here we see the church to the right and the palace to the left. And in front of us we see a convent where the Franciscans were living, and also the church was a Franciscan church. Now here's a little map of Naples, and quite in the middle of this picture you see, it's very small, but you see 576, which is one of the conservatories. And it's interesting to see it from above on this map. We see a lot of school buildings around here. We see a church with a little cross for the altar, and we see a schoolyard. I imagine there must have been some kind of entrance to the school. And we see also a a herbal garden. Yeah? So the garden is actually attached to the school, and it is also known that the conservatory had an apothecary. Yeah? So there was an apothecary attached to the school, where some gardener could make like medicines, or we would probably call it drugs, and these drugs were necessary for the boys in this school if they would like to be castrated. There were castrati in these schools. They were using these drugs to hold down the pain in this odious operation. Yeah, so these things were officially forbidden, but everybody knew that this was happening, and there were castrati that hoped for some good career as singers in the opera houses of Europe. Yeah, here we see the same street just outside of the city wall of Naples, and we see here the entrance of the school and the top of the church and the school buildings around. And here in between is probably the garden and the apothecary. Yeah, and you see it's quite near the Gulf of Naples, the sea. Now the one we just looked at is the number 3, Santa Maria di Loreto, and there were 3 other conservatories. La Pietà de Turchini was a more old-fashioned conservatory. We had the I Poveri di Gesù Cristo, which was like a theological seminar where you also could become a priest. And we had the Sant'Onofrio a Capuana. These schools had a somewhat different approach to teaching, so I will tell a little bit more about that later. Here we see actually the spots where these schools were from the beginning. The number 2 is actually the Onofrio. It is today a police station. And if you go inside, you can still see the old staircase that is described by Charles Burney in his travels through Europe. When he enters this church, he recalls this staircase. It's still there. Yeah, and there is a little fence where there is the old school bell is still hanging there. So there are still some signs of this old 18th century music school left in this place. Now the number 3, the Loreto, is actually nothing left of the building, but there is a hospital at the point where this old conservatory once stood. And the number 4 is the Turchini, which the church is still there, and we still have the entrance, but it has been rebuilt more or less, so there's not much left of the school building, unfortunately. Now here is a little reference from a book about partimento, the rules of learning how to work with partimento. It says, the learned teachers need to ensure that their students practice in all keys the scales, the dissonances, and the movimenti di bassi, which were basically sequences, since it is the only way to be able to play the partimento well. Suppose they ever find any missing rules or errors, in that case they can add and adjust as they please, since nothing has been done here other than to arrange the rules which are well known by everyone, and to give beginners some guidance so that they do not play randomly and can then more easily learn counterpoint. So the goal of learning partimento, the goal of working with the hands on the keyboard was to learn counterpoint, but practically, rather than through books. So there was very little written material, and the learning was based on practical imitation and variation. Okay, let's dive a little bit into the archives. I will show some stuff that I have been photographing in various archives, not only in Italy but all over Europe. Here we see how they usually start their process of learning. In this case we see a cadence. This was probably the first thing they played on the keyboard if they came to the first lesson, and the teacher maybe played something like this. And they had to imitate it. In various positions and with various different ways to play these cadences. And they learned a lot of different ways to do this, and they had to be able to vary these different versions. Now from that, they extended these small entities by playing slightly larger cadences. And then with an extra step. Etc., etc. And this was done in major and in minor and in all keys, with a lot of variations for every cadential progression. So this was probably the work that was done in the first 1 or 2 months. It was a lot of work doing the cadences in the beginning, and that was very helpful because they would appear in almost any piece. So it was a very good foundation they started with. Now here we see a little bit later on in the same curriculum, we would find like sequential patterns, like sequences of 7 chords, or extended cadences, or cadences in new keys, etc., etc. So usually there were maybe 100 pages of these kind of exercises, and it took maybe 1.5, 2 years, or maybe even more, to become really skilled in playing all these exercises and to create personal versions of cadences, of scales, and of sequences. Now, and after that, as soon as these cadences and scales and sequences had been learned, students had to combine them in various small pieces. So the very first pieces that they actually play by ear are played by the teacher, and they are built from these elements that they have been practicing one by one. Yeah, so they are now combined into small pieces. And this was, of course, a gradual process, so that they learned this step by step over the course of a few years. No books, just listening, playing, and varying until you could speak the language of the keyboard player and speak the language of counterpoint. Yeah? Now, just to show the implications of these ways of learning, here we have the a photograph of Mozart's teacher in Italy, Giambattista Martini. He was in Bologna. They had a similar trajectory of learning. And here we see the book in Martini's autograph in his hand, where you see how they learned diminution of a bass pattern. And in this case, they could play this bass through imitational stock patterns. So they learned also imitation through these exercises. Now, similar strategies. Here, a figured bass. Interesting here in the margin, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look carefully, you see that Martini actually jots down small annotations to show from where he got this exercise. In this case, it's actually a little segment from a trio sonata by Arcangelo Corelli. And he writes C.O.R. Corelli, Opus 3, Sonata number 1. Yeah, so this little exercise is actually distilled or obtained from a trio sonata. And this is interesting also because the trio sonatas, they gave a perfect three-part style. So these references to the original trio sonatas, they tell us something about the ideal of playing. So we should imagine the style of this contrapuntal language as a three-part style rather than a four-part style. And so, which made it easier to hear always the upper voice, the bass, which could be read, and the middle voice. And we wouldn't get into the trouble of four-part harmony, which became more usual in the 19th century, where it is much harder to hear the difference between an alto and a tenor, especially if they make voice crossings. It is hopeless to learn that kind of style by ear. But the three-part style, the contrapuntal style of the trio sonatas by Corelli, is actually much easier to learn, especially if they don't go too fast. You can actually learn them by ear. Yeah, so, and in this case, Martini makes simple exercises which can be varied and repeated many, many times. This is probably something that Mozart also was doing on when he was around maybe 14, 15 years old. Now, in this case, we see exercises of melodic diminution, also from a manuscript in Martini's hand, also Bologna's manuscript. This is part of a new article that will appear soon in the Oxford Handbook of Musical Variation and Thematic Techniques. I think it will appear in a few months or so. And here we have Haydn's teacher, Nicola Porpora, which I also mentioned in this last article that I just mentioned. A newly identified manuscript found in an archive in Croatia. In this source, you can see how Porpora taught counterpoint through variation of melodies and variation of bass lines. So if you got a bass line from the teacher, you had to create various melodies. And if you got a melody, you had to create various bass lines to it. And maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 different variants of one exercise, which was a very effective way of learning. Here you see an example of this technique. So the melody is given here on top, and the first bass line, and then an alternative bass line, and then yet another alternative bass line, and then a bass line in like walking bass, and then the next exercise. Okay, now we come to the topic of this lecture, which is about melodic invention. As you may know, the 18th century was a lot about like counterpoint, imitation, fugue. There were many like solistic thorough bass fugues to learn to get into fugal improvisation. But the further we get into history, the more people start to become a little bit uncomfortable that there was so much mechanic learning of standard patterns, but without addressing what was seen as the most important part of musical composition, which was melody. Especially the opera composers in the early 19th century, they really wanted to do something about learning melody and not so much only standardized patterns on the keyboard. Now, of course, these old masters that were teaching partimento, they were thinking a lot about how to do that, how to combine these new intentions with this old system of learning through cadences and sequences and scales. And one of the most successful composers who really built melodic invention into his system is the Neapolitan composer Nicola Zingarelli. Before I show Zingarelli's exercises and before I will play a little bit of it, I just want to show a little bit from the tradition, from Zingarelli's tradition. So the start of what Zingarelli also did in the beginning was learning cadences. It could look like this. So here we see 4 different ways to prepare the seventh. With standardized bass patterns and with standardized figures, and they had to play variations on them by ear. So they learned these patterns by ear. Now this led to small pieces. We already saw that. So here a cadence, another cadence, a little modulation, a new cadence. Modulation back to the main key, a new cadence, and then a scale downwards with tight bass elements, and then a final cadence. So you see the elements are very, very simple in the beginning, and this could be played. So if I would play this, the first one. You hear that I play actually a 3-part style when I realize an exercise like this. So it is very much possible to cut this into pieces and to learn students to imitate these various cadences. So that is what they were doing. Here you see actually an example of realizations. Here are a few examples from a manuscript from Liège in Belgium, where you see the polyphonic style, so a little piece of the partimento, and then how it is realized. The voices, they start at different points, and they are using slurs and complementary rhythm to really create like a polyphonic contrapuntal idea rather than chords. So this was very much the tendency in these kinds of manuscripts. Now, these are a little bit the ingredients of the curriculum. So how to prepare the fourth, then how to prepare the seventh, then how to prepare the ninth, the cadenza doppia, how to use the sharp 6/4 chord, so getting into modulation, the 6/5 chord on the fourth scale degree, then the rule of the octave, or as they called it at the time, the regola della scala, the 4/2 chord, a sharp 4/2 chord, 5/6 patterns on ascending scales, and 7/6 descending patterns on descending scales, and then other kinds of sequential patterns. And all of this is, of course, varied extensively. So, Zingarelli, what did he do? So the first book of his partimenti is, according to this manuscript, this is a Neapolitan manuscript, 46-160. This is the call number of the library. It says actually the date 1821, composte nell'anno, so composed probably in 1821. And most of his students had to copy these exercises for their own use. So there are quite a few of these handwritten copies of Zingarelli's partimenti. Now here we have an example of Zingarelli. This is a little bit old-fashioned style, this particular one. If we see what he does in the bass, and a scalar segment, and then if we would do something with this, any student in Naples would know that if you do this, you would know that this is part of a cadential pattern. So this is the standard procedure to do on this particular pattern. And then in bar 3 it says imitazione, which means that we have to do something with the pattern that we just got and try to make some kind of imitation, either on the same scale degree or maybe on the 5th scale degree. We don't know that. It's just said that do something like imitative on that point, and we have to find out what we can do. So maybe we could do another one. You see that? So there's actually a second point where the theme can be entered. It is not the word imitation is not given at this point, but we just see that, okay, if we have 3 voices, we can actually do one entrance after each other. First the bass, then the melody, and then the middle voice. Okay, and if we then a final cadence. Now I just played this without too much preparation, but just to give you an impression of what can be done here. Of course, if I practice a little bit, and then I will find better solutions and will find a better way to realize this. But I think you already grasp the idea of this. So you have to play counterpoint, you have to create imitations, and to realize this in such a way that it won't sound like too dull or uninspired. So if we can do something like give it a little crunch with some ornaments or whatever, that would be a great advantage. Yeah? So by learning to do this, you get performative skills, but you will also get skills in counterpoint and skills, and it will become easier to start with written composition, because you can already imagine what your hands would do when you see a bass line. Yeah, so there's a lot of like internal knowledge, mental compositional skills are built up under maybe a period of a few years. Okay, here we have an example of the more melodic style. So this is in G minor. It starts on the third. Okay, we get a few hints by Zingarelli through the figures. So he gives us a little contrary motion idea. Yeah, a little melodic idea that could be used over the first two bars. And then we see that what we actually played through the figures is actually reappearing in the bass in bar 3 and 4. Okay, which invites us to think in terms of invertible counterpoint. Yeah, so the question now becomes, okay, what we just played in the bass, could that actually become the melody in bar 3? Yeah, so if we just exchange the material. It actually works. Now the question is just, what do we do with the possible middle voice? Modulation. Okay, the challenge here is of course to create variations. Every time these elements get back, maybe we could flip the upper voices, or we could make like a rhythmical variation without losing the idea of invertibility. So if we could combine these kind of ideas, it would be best, and we would get invertible counterpoint, imitation, but also variation, and of course melodic quality. What we also can hear in this style is actually phrasing. We hear small, like motivic elements of 2 bars that are repeated. So there is a kind of symmetry growing in the music. This is far from the like continuous fugal style of maybe 40, 50 years earlier. So this is becoming more melodic and more phrased and more like segments. So there's more about form going on here, and there's more about melody going on here, which is of course a challenge for the student to create these like phrased way of playing. How can we do that? Yeah. Okay, here is another one. This is one in F minor. Okay, let's see if I recall how this was going. Sorry. Now you hear here that there are like melodic elements coming back with repetitions. I changed the figures a little bit just for the sake of variation, but and also contrapuntal elements like these patterns. Like the 6/5 chords. 6/5, and then a modulation. You have to recall what did I play in minor, and how do I adapt this now to a major variant. Yeah, so there's also a lot of like ear-based playing involved in while you read it. You have to actually adapt to the new key and see if you can remember what you did. Yeah. So yeah, this is fun stuff to practice and fun stuff to learn counterpoint. More practical less studies in books. Okay, something similar here in A minor. Now, very much based on the scale. Also here, this can be done much better than what I am able to show here, but you get an impression of what's actually going on here. So you use the harmonization of the scale, you learn to recognize the modulations and to try to spot the right points where to when to insert the notes that lead to the modulation. That's a skill that is very, very important. And to get fluency in this modulatory trajectory that is shown by the composer. And the music is actually very good. These were excellent composers who created pedagogical material, completely practically based, and great fun to do today. Now this is all coming out in the next months or so. I am preparing a complete edition in 3 volumes. It is over 400 pages. No, let's see. Yeah, almost 400 pages of material. So the first book of Partimenti was what I showed today in a few examples. And there is a second book that was composed in the early 1830s. And in the third volume, I will also add one manuscript, which is very special. It's a manuscript in the hand of, so an autograph by Zingarelli, where he has bass lines that previously had been thought to be partimenti, but that are actually exercises that Zingarelli composed for his written studies in counterpoint. And it's almost impossible to see the difference between a partimento and a single staff disposition that was used for written studies. But the difference is that he designs these bass lines in such a way that you can make canons or imitations in the beginning. So if you make a 4-part realization on paper, then you can actually find many places where you can make imitations. So there is also some stuff that can be used to elaborate them in on paper. And of course it helps a lot to do the course as it was designed. So start with the simple exercises on the keyboard, and then you gradually learn to do more difficult stuff. There are lots of partimento fugues, really difficult ones too. And then you gradually grow into the written counterpoint studies. Now, many of the composers that we know from 19th century Italy, so Donizetti, Bellini, they all use this material. So many of the great composers of the Italian opera tradition, they were actually working with these kind of materials, and they learned how to make beautiful melodies through these materials. So that's also a historical curiosity with this material, that it actually has shown to create very good results. We think of the beautiful melodies of Bellini. How could he do that? So there's something in here that is, I think, very, very important and new, because nobody has looked at this material for centuries. This is now being digged up, and people start to play these things. So that's really very interesting to see how the written traditions of counterpoint are complemented or being complemented with practical work on the keyboard. So performers can actually learn the art of counterpoint, not on paper, but rather with their hands on the keyboard. So with this, I would like to round off this lecture about the melodic traditions of the inventional traditions of the early 19th century Neapolitan school. And again, I want to thank you all for having me, and I say a big thanks, and Slava Ukraina.